going to have a lecture on how Active Directory affects SQL Server. Ryan Adams is going to be the speaker today. I'm Julie Blomquist, and the sponsor for our virtual chapter is Dell Software. We want you to stay involved with PASS. PASS is a free membership. If you can sign up, then you can also set up to go and get information from other virtual chapters. We have SQL Saturday events, which are coming up in the end of November here and December. And here's some of the October, November virtual chapter meetings. But if you go through PASS, you can see a full virtual chapter listing and sign up to get notification of their meeting schedules. PASS also has an outstanding volunteer program. Submissions can be sent anytime to the volunteer recognition at SQLPass.org. And this lets PASS recognize those who are outstanding within the SQL community and within PASS. There is the Business Analytics Conference coming up May 7th through the 9th, and they're calling for people to start registering. This is going to be in San Jose this year. Uh-oh. There we go. Sorry about that. Let me go back to the last slide. So today, like I said, is going to be, let's see, from current slide, is Ryan is going to be talking about the Active Directory and how it affects SQL Server. Ryan's worked for Verizon for 15 years, and he's the sole SQL Server DBA for his group. That's pretty amazing. I know how difficult that can be. His primary focus has been on the SQL Server engine and performance, but he also works with SSRS and SSIS. Prior to becoming a SQL DBA, he was a senior Active Directory architect and an identity management consultant where he architected the company's world Active Directory infrastructure supporting over 250,000 users. He enjoys being involved with the SQL community and serves on the board of directors for the North Texas SQL Server User Group and is the president of the PASS Performance Virtual Chapter. He also serves as a regional mentor for PASS and holds the following certificates. You could read all those. I'm pretty amazed. But thank you, Ryan, and I'm going to change this over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Wait for that to pop up. All right. Drag some stuff around here. Oh, you guys are seeing presenter view, aren't you? Bear with me, folks. Let's see if that works better. Julie, you're still seeing presenter view there, or are we seeing regular view?
Well, I see a little bit about the LinkedIn on the left, and then I only see a partial Active Directory, title panel. Here, let
Okay,
me.
it's the wrong
It,
one. It's still showing the first one.
Try maximizing the webinar viewer.
Let me switch over to this one here. That is definitely not the right one.
so I see your slide on the left and About Me on the right, where it says Next Slide.
Yeah. All right.
I thought we had it. We did a test.
Yeah, I gotta love how that stuff always works. So unfortunately, I'm using multiple monitors here, and it doesn't really want to play nice. So let me try and get this on the right monitor.
That's full screen. Oops.
Hang tight. Here we go.
There you go.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Well, the good news is Julie did a fantastic introduction, so there's not a whole lot for me to talk about there, other than, let me go to the next slide here. Just a little bit about myself, and Julie's kind of already covered most of this. That slide did not change. So a little bit about myself. As you can see, I've spoke quite a few places. I spoke at the past summit this year, and IT Dev Connections, and I had the honor of being on SQL Cruise and teaching on that. So it's been a pretty good year for me. I do like to talk a lot, as you can obviously tell. As Julie mentioned, I do work for Verizon. I've worked here for a little over 15 years, and I've done a lot of different stuff in that amount of time. Everything from desktop server and everything in between. But before I fell in love with SQL Server, I was doing Active Directory, and I actually designed and architected all of their Active Directory worldwide for over 250,000 people. That's just employees, not actual objects in Active Directory. Then I fell in love with SQL Server and I haven't turned back since. And that's what I like about this presentation, because I'm able to take two things that I really, really like and put them together. We kind of get to see how these things interact. So although this session is pretty high on Active Directory, as far as content goes, what I really want you to get out of this is, what can Active Directory do to your box? When you see weird things happen on your SQL box, is it possible that it's coming from Active Directory or an Active Directory component? And if it is, how do you identify that, right? So a few of the things we'll talk about today. We'll start off with talking about DNS, domain naming service. That's what we're familiar with when we hit the internet. We type a URL in. Computers like IP addresses. Us as humans, we much prefer a nice friendly name. Then we'll take a look at group policies. We're going to spend a good chunk of time here. The reason we spend a good chunk of time on group policies is when it comes to being a perpetrator and having very different interesting effects on our SQL Server, or quite honestly on the operating system at all, this is 9 times out of 10 where it's coming from. If you ever find a setting that you change and it gets changed back from what you had, you need to look at group policy objects. The odds are that's where your issue is. Then we're going to take a look at security groups. So there's several different types of security groups inside Active Directory. We'll talk about what they are and what the difference is between those groups. We'll take a look at password policies. A lot of us these days are subjected to things like PCI, SOX, HIPAA, and all these types of things. and they're very heavy about what are your password policies. We want to make sure that we're protected and we're set up properly. And the interesting thing about that is they don't necessarily come from where you think they come from, depending upon whether you're using SQL Auth or Windows authentication. Then we'll take a look at SQL Agent. Not a lot with SQL Agent here, but there's one particular instance that I see over and over and over that I want you to be aware of. And this happens all the time. And when you see that slide and I have you read what it is, I'm sure a good chunk of you guys out there are going to, you're going to recognize that right off the bat. And then Kerberos. Obviously, there's no way we're going to get into Active Directory and SQL Server and not talk about Kerberos, so we'll definitely spend a good chunk of time there. So let's talk about DNS first. The first question you got to ask yourself is, when is name resolution important? When do I care about DNS, and when does it have an effect on me? And I came up with two examples. So my first one is outgoing. Okay? This means that as the client on my SQL server, I am trying to find data or consume data somewhere outside of my SQL server. Or maybe I'm just trying to authenticate to something or verify something on the network. Maybe you're using linked servers because you need to query Oracle or another SQL server or something like that. Maybe you're using open rosette calls that you don't have to have a linked server, but you can just dynamically make an open rosette call. You can actually query Active Directory using open rosette calls. And that can be very, very handy, because when you look at all of the data and different things inside of Active Directory, all the different object types, although they're all arranged in a hierarchical kind of manner, if you were really trying to search and find stuff that way, it's not easy to find. But if I can go into SQL, write a query, pull it right into SQL Server, now I can slice and dice that any way that I want to. And that is a very powerful thing. If you're using SQL Agent and your job type is PowerShell or Command Exec, the reason I list those two is because if you're using those, not all the time, but the vast majority of the time, the reason you're using them is because you're trying to find data that exists somewhere outside of your server, which means you need DNS, because that name has to be resolved to an IP address. If we don't get that, then we've got a problem. Now, of course, the other example of when it's important to me, and this is the obvious one, right, is the inverse. It's incoming, right? We're DBAs. We're hosting data for a reason, because someone or something or some application is trying to consume and utilize the data that we're hosting. That might be an application. And that's not a huge surface footprint if maybe it's like a website app where everybody's just hitting this one website, so you're really just resolving one URL. But where things get a little more complicated is, what if you have an app that happens to be on 1,000, 2, 4, 30, 40, 50,000 workstations on your network that are trying to get to your box to consume that data? Now all of a sudden things have gotten a little bit more complicated. Scripts. I wrote a script a few years ago that would actually go out and inventory all of my servers. This is fantastically cool, because you may have these different inventory systems that your company has, but they might not have all the information that you need from the SQL perspective. And I was able to write a script that would dynamically look at OUs. We haven't gotten there, but I'll explain what an OU is. But it's a folder. Look at that folder. Any server that's in that folder, we add it to our table. If it gets removed and it disappears, maybe we decommission a server, it automatically puts it in an archive table. That's cool. And it goes out and hits all of these servers and grabs every piece of information that I need off of it. Operating system, service pack, whatever it is. We can gather all of that information. But if that script's running from a centralized box, it's got to be able to resolve the name of your server properly. Kerberos and service principal names, that's what an SPN is down there at the bottom. We haven't gotten into those. I'm not going to delve into them here because I have a whole section on those. But DNS becomes very, very important when you're trying to authenticate using Kerberos, and obviously it's required if you want an SPN. So the question I like to ask is, can DNS be tricky? Can DNS trick us? Yes, it can. DNS can be very, very tricky. It can be a tough one to kind of troubleshoot and figure it out, especially if you're not the DNS guy, because you don't have access to really see DNS and what's registered and what's going on there. Here's some of the areas where this can be somewhat problematic for us. So the first one is slow replication. Unfortunately, with slow replication, and let's say that your user happens to be in California, and your database happens to be on a box that's sitting in New York, and the IP address of your server changes. Well, when it changes its IP address, that change gets registered on a DNS server that's local to it. So there's probably going to be a DNS server that's there in New York, and it's going to make the change there. However, it takes time for that change to get replicated all the way out to California. So now all of a sudden you've got clients calling you saying that your database is down, they can't access it. Why? Because they're asking the DNS server that's local to them in California to resolve that name to that IP, and they still have the old IP registered. It hasn't replicated yet. And until it replicates, you're not going to get where you need to go. So if you have a very slow replication mechanism going on, then that can be extremely problematic. And now all of a sudden it's one of those weird things, because it's kind of an issue, but not really. It's going to automatically fix itself once it replicates, but you're still getting calls all the time until that actually occurs. Multiple host A records. So host A record is translating a name into an IP address. This is considered a forward lookup. Now most DNS also has a reverse lookup. That's the auto PTR. It's a pointer record. Usually having so I can have, let's say, server 1 and server 4 point to IP 1. I can actually have two of those names, server 1 and server 4, both pointing to the same IP. That's not such a big deal on a forward lookup, because odds are if you're trying to get to server 1, the guy said, hey, my data's on server 1, you need to connect to that, and gave you the name. Or maybe he just gave you the direct IP address, in which case DNS doesn't even come into play. However, if they have an automatic pointer record created, now there's two. So when you look it up in reverse and you say, hey, what name is attached to this particular IP, now you get two names back. That's a very interesting scenario, because how do you know which name you're supposed to be using? Now from the SQL perspective, you might think that that doesn't matter. Hey, look, as long as it resolves, no matter which name they use, they're still getting to the same box and the same IP. That might not matter. You're right. It probably doesn't if you're using NTLM. But if you're using Kerberos, again, we haven't gotten there, then this won't work. If this happens to be your web front end that's sitting in front of your SQL server, and that's what the users see, and that's what they're complaining about, and they say it's the database on the back end, but it's really not. It's actually the website, because there's host headers. IIS can run host headers, and depending upon which server name it sees in that URL line, it can point you a completely different website. Now all of a sudden things aren't working quite as nice as you thought they were. The same thing can happen here with CNAME records. So that's an alias. So instead of having two host records pointing to the same IP, what we could do is we could have an alias. The alias points to the host record, and the host points to the IP. And that's a very common thing to do. A lot of times companies will have naming conventions for their servers inside their companies. And the issue we run into with that is that they're always not friendly. It's not something you really want to have to type into a URL for all of your users to hit your application or to hit your database box. So what we do is we create a friendly name. So if it's, server NY245, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, some kind of weird thing like that, instead we can say, you know what, just hit myapp.com. And we can create an alias that points to that. And then they never know about the server name, and that's fantastically cool. That's a really nice thing. And what's even better is if you ever need to change the name of the server, you don't have to change the client connection string. You don't have to go update anything, because you're still pointing to that alias. Here's the kicker. If that happens and you change the server name, you still have to repoint the alias to the new name. And I see that happen a lot where they go, great, they're pointing to the alias, so I can do whatever I need to on the server. I change the name of the server, and the next thing you know, the help desk is getting slammed with calls. Why? Because that alias is pointing to a record that no longer exists because you changed it. You have to repoint it. It's not dynamic. And that comment is specifically to Microsoft DNS. For using third party, that may be different. But I can tell you if you're using Active Directory DNS, that those two things don't follow each other. Split DNS, I won't spend a lot of time here. This isn't overly common. I'm still surprised it is not as common as you would think. But what this means is that your DNS name doesn't match your Active Directory DNS name. They can be completely separate. So Microsoft.com is how we go hit MSDN, Microsoft.com, TechNet, whatever it happens to be. That's how we address Microsoft externally. But internally, and I'm not saying this is their namespace, I have no idea what it is, but let's say it's MSFT.com, and that's their Active Directory domain. Okay, that's a split DNS scenario. The problem is sometimes you may have servers registered in both. If you're an internal employee, you might be able to address the same server that's an internet-facing server, both as a server1.microsoft.com or server2.msft.com. The problem there is Kerberos. Again, we're getting to the Kerberos section, but you have to use the Active Directory domain name in order to have a successful Kerberos connection. So that means server1.msft.com is what we have to use. If we use Microsoft.com, we'll get there, but it's not going to use Kerberos. It may fall back to NTLM, or if we're not accepting NTLM authentication, then we just get denied access. A lot of times I see this happen when companies merge, or they do a spin-off or a sell-off. Those types of scenarios where they've got more than one Active Directory coming together, then we'll see split domain names that way. And then you have to make sure that you're using the right namespace for the server that you're trying to get to. Don't rely on a secondary DNS server. And what I mean by this is if we were to go in and you were to right-click on your TCP/IP configuration, and you go over to DNS, you're allowed to put in a primary and a secondary. And that second bullet point there is what I want you to remember. The primary and the secondary should resolve all names. Here's why. This is how it flows. This is how it works. So you as a client query DNS, and you always go to the primary DNS server first. There are three different things that can happen. The first is that you can get a no answer. The second is you could get a yes answer. And the third one is we get a no response. Now, I've colored the no and the yes green. And I've colored them green for a reason. The yes is obvious, right? That means we said, where is server1.com? And he said, I know exactly where he's at. He's at 192.168.1.1. There you go. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. But he could come back and go, you know what? I don't have a record for that server. I'm sorry, I don't know. But no is colored green because it's a valid answer. It's not the answer that you expected it to be. It's not the answer we wanted it to be. But it is technically a valid answer. And in that case, then we don't get where we're going. Now the last one says no response. Now that one's red because no response means that that server, the primary DNS server, is completely down. We get no reply, no response at all. Then, and only then, does the client go down and ask the secondary server. So if you're thinking in that Microsoft example, hey, my primary server will resolve Microsoft.com, and my secondary will do MSFT.com, I'm good to go. You will never get a successful resolution on MSFT.com because it's always going to ask the primary, and if he's up and running, he's going to say, nope, I can't help you, I don't know. Too bad. Only if he were to die completely and get no response will we actually go ask the secondary. But then he can only tell you about msft.com, not Microsoft.com. So now all of a sudden the Microsoft.com start failing. So that's why I tell you that secondary bullet point there, make sure the primary and the secondary can resolve both, or however many namespaces you may have. You may have several. Keep that in mind. The other thing with DNS is the suffix search order. Now, suffix search order is kind of interesting, and it kind of helps me get by some of those the previous issues that we were just talking about. What we can do here is say, you know what? If I type into a URL or a connection string or whatever, server 1, I don't put .microsoft.com on it. I just type in server 1. Well, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to try and make a NetBIOS call. Well, a NetBIOS call is broadcast. It's basically a shout out on the local network, but only on that local subnet. That broadcast traffic is not routed beyond that. So if that server is not on the same subnet as the client that made the call, then you're not going to find him or get a response. That's where DNS comes in. So with DNS, what we can do with the suffix search orders, we could put 4 or 5, however many domains that you want listed in there. And let's say we're looking for Microsoft.com, and our DNS suffix search order has msft.com first, and then Microsoft.com second. What it will try to do is it'll make the shout out, it gets no response, it says, okay, the NetBIOS call didn't work, I'm going to try server1.microsoft.com, it's the first one in my search order. If it gets a response, fantastic, off to the races we go. But if it doesn't, then it moves on to the next one. Then it will try server1.msft.com. If we get an answer, great. If we don't, we move on to the next, and so on and so forth. Now, it does do it in order. So it starts from the top and works its way down, which means that if you have 500 servers in domain 1 and 20 in domain 4, then you need to make sure domain 1 is listed first, because most of the proper resolution is going to happen. Most things are going to fall in that domain. And obviously the last bullet point there, if you're already using a fully qualified domain name, meaning I went ahead and typed in server1.msft.com that I was trying to get to, then we don't even need DNS because we gave it exactly where we needed to go. Or we don't need, I'm sorry, we need DNS, but we don't need the suffix search order at that point. Okay, so now that we're done with DNS, let's take a look at group policy. And this is where I told you that this is where weird things can happen. So group policy is a lot like what it sounds like, but it's a grouping of settings. So what this means is that I can take a bunch of configuration settings and say that I can put them together in a policy and say I want all of these servers to look like this. So I can say I want every single Exchange server in my environment to be configured this way. I want every single SQL server to look like this with these settings. We can do that. And what's cool is that allows us to ensure and guarantee that we have consistency and standards that are across the board. And not only does it allow us to do that, but it persists those changes, which means that if somebody goes, and maybe it's a server guy, he gets a wild hair and decides that he thinks the setting should be something different, then it'll change it right back. And that's cool. And that's why I tell you, if you magically see weird settings start changing on you, you change them and they change right back within an hour or two, odds are it's a group policy object. Now, when we put all of these settings together inside of a policy, they can be applied coming from Active Directory in several different places. I know this sounds like this is way out of the scope of SQL Server, but it's very important to understand where these come from. And I want you guys to understand the platform that you're sitting on. You are sitting on an Active Directory platform. Then you need to at least know something about Active Directory. I've always been a huge proponent of, no matter if you're sitting on, if you're on a cluster, you need to know something about clustering. If you're sitting in a virtual machine, you need to know something about VMware or Hyper-V. Whatever platform you're on, know something about it. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to be an expert on every single thing, but you need to at least have a general idea of what's going on. And Active Directory is one of those huge pieces that can have some very interesting effects we want to make sure we get covered. I can tell you that even to this day, I still get calls about issues with group policies, even though I haven't actually actively done Active Directory for the company for a while. These are really complicated to hunt down, but if you understand the flow, you will at least know when you have these weird things happen and the Active Directory guy can't figure it out and he's out there Googling for it, you can at least point him in the right direction if you are armed with this knowledge. So the first place where these things can flow from, and I'll show you the flow here in another step or two, but the first place is they can come down from a site. Now, a site in Active Directory, and it's not too important to know exactly what that is and what that means, but a site is just a grouping of subnets. Okay, that's not something you really have to worry about. Your Active Directory guy will hopefully take care of that properly, but that's where you can start from. When you do that with a site, it's very rare that I see somebody put a policy that high up because it affects everything, possibly even multiple domains or multiple forests at that level. The other one is what you're probably most familiar with is a domain. I will see some at domains, again, not as many as you're ever going to see at an OU level because it's pretty broad scope. And then the OU level, and OU stands for Organizational Unit, it's just a folder. Just think of it as a folder, that's all it is. Okay? Active Directory it's an LDAP-based directory. It's based off the old X500 standards. That's all it is. So just think folder. Most of your policies will be applied at the folder level. Now we can filter them because even at a folder level, that's not very granular because if you've ever gone out and looked at your directory, you might see that your server is in an OU that has a bunch of other servers in there that may or may not be yours. There might be user objects in there, desktops, servers, there could be contact objects, there could be all kinds of other object types or things that belong to other people other than you in an OU, depending upon how your Active Directory has been architected. We can filter beyond that, and this is where things start to get complicated. You can do it by object type. The two object types are users and computers. We can either put a bunch of settings in there that affect just computer objects or a bunch that are just doing computers or user objects. We can get more granular. We can do it with security groups, and that's probably the most common. So we can say, look, we've got 5 applications, and they're all in one OU. We only want this to affect application number 3. We can add all of those to a group, filter that policy based on the group. WMI is not used very often, but in my opinion it should be. It stands for Windows Management Instrumentation. This is what I've always considered to be one of Microsoft's hidden little gems, the thing that they don't talk about too much, but it's got this really rich, amazing data that's just sitting there waiting for you to utilize it. You can get almost any piece of information you can even imagine from your server from WMI. But Microsoft doesn't talk about it a whole lot. It's starting to get a little more coverage now because of PowerShell. With VBScript and stuff back in the days, it wasn't as easy to use. There weren't a lot of utilities to go in there and figure out what the options were. But there is one that you can download and it's been available for quite some time. But with PowerShell, it's a lot more native. So now we're starting to see a little bit more of that come out. But there's a lot of stuff that's utilized in PowerShell that you get this information from that's using WMI on the back end and you never even see it. So here's how that precedence works, and here's why it's important. Because I guarantee when you start having one of these things, start changing settings and tearing stuff up on your servers, you're going to want to figure out where it came from. So our first one says, so everything flows from top down, right? So we start at the site, it flows down to a domain, from there it flows down to the OU, and then OU under OU, and so on and so forth. For as many OUs and folders as you have, it will flow all the way down. So our first rule here says that the lower level wins. Okay, so let's take a look at policy 1, and we'll put policy 2 up here. Now policy 1 is sitting at the domain level, and policy 2 is sitting at the OU level. And let's say we have 5 different settings in policy 1. Now, if this guy were to flow down, and let's say 3 of those 5 settings do not conflict, they are not also set in policy 2. But 2 of them are, meaning that there's 2 settings that have been set with different values in each of the policies. When policy 1 flows down, who wins? What happens? Well, it's twofold. The policy or the settings, those 3 that did not conflict, they will apply, they will win. However, our precedent says that the lower level wins. That is true for the ones that conflict. Policy 2 is at the lower level, so he is going to win on those conflicts. The settings that were in policy 1 will not apply, only the 3 that did not conflict. We're going to use the exact same example here, but we're going to talk about blocking policy inheritance. Now, we still got policy 1 and policy 2 in play here. We have a block that's set here on the OU level. And that should mean that it's going to block anything above it. So when policy 1 flows down, still 5 settings, 3 that do not conflict, 2 that do conflict. What happens? Well, block literally blocks everything. So it will block policy 1 completely. So before, where the 3 that did not conflict would have applied, they will no longer apply at all. Only the things that are set in policy 2 will. So our last rule here is called the no override. Now you'll notice that there's 2 interesting kickers to that underneath it. One is that it wins over a lower level. Okay, so that's the reverse of precedence number 1. And it wins over a block, which is the reverse of number 2 there on the list. Same scenario, policy 1 and 2, domain and OU level. You notice I put this star up here in policy 1. So that's the no override we set in the policy that basically says anything that's in this policy should not be overridden. There's nothing below it that should override this policy. Let's go ahead and keep that block in play because that's the most complicated scenario. So let's take a look at that. When policy 1 flows down, what happens to those 5 settings? Well, the 3 that do not conflict, they will apply because they win over the lower level, which is policy 2, so they beat level 2, but they also beat the block. So they will apply. The same for the ones that do conflict. So all 5 settings will apply in this scenario, and policy 2 loses out. Now, that was the most complicated from the perspective of having a block and having a lower, the block policy inheritance and a no override at the same time. But these OU structure, this is a very shallow example structure. You could have hundreds of OUs under OUs, so you can imagine how complicated it could get. Now here's the real reasons, and I'll give you a minute to kind of look at this. But here's the real reasons why you care so much about group policies. It's all about what they can do. And think about it. They can install software on your SQL server? Yeah, they sure can. You betcha. And here's the interesting thing about that software install. And here's the interesting about any of these settings inside of a group policy. If a lot of people will think that they can go in and, you know what, I'm going to stop my domain admins from doing this. I'm going to go in and take the domain admin group out of the local administrators group on my server. Because if they're not local admins, then they can't do anything to my box. That is not true. Group policies get applied by the system. So whether they have access to your server or not, they can every single thing on this list to your box. And you can change it back to your heart's content, and it will just reverse itself over and over and over again. You can't beat this. Scripts that run at startup, shut down, log in, and log off, a script can do anything to your box, completely tear it to pieces, break all kinds of stuff. File system permissions, registry settings, they can turn locked pages in memory on, but there's some settings in here that are good too. So think about this. What if I wanted instant file initialization turned on in all of my SQL boxes? I can do that. What if I wanted power plans to be set for high performance instead of a balanced power plan? I can do that. So now all of a sudden you're thinking, man, I need to go buy my DBA, or I need to go buy my Active Directory guy, a 6-pack. Yes, you should, because you want to be friends with him. Take him out to lunch, because this stuff here he can make sure is consistent on every one of your servers and can't be changed by a junior DBA or a server admin for that matter. Now here is one of the nastiest group policy misconstrued things that I've ever seen. And this is an interesting one. So we talked about DNS suffix search order settings, right? Let's say that we work for Contoso.com, and we have a group policy that says, you know what, I want Contoso.com to be in my DNS suffix search order. I want to make sure that it's resolvable. But Contoso buys Litware.com. And so you're like, you know what, I can resolve Contoso.com because it's the primary, but I also want to be able to resolve Litware.com, meaning that I type server 1 in, either I'm pinging it, I put it in a connection string, I put it in IE or Chrome or whatever browser you're using to hit a website. If I type in server 1, I want to make sure that that it will attempt to resolve server1.litware.com. All right, great. So you go into your TCP/IP configuration settings. You can see in the screenshot here on the left. Go to the DNS tab. I don't have any DNS servers here in this example, but they would be in that top box if you did. So even though there's a primary and a secondary, you can actually add more than that. You can add 3, 4, 5 if you want. But again, make sure that they resolve every namespace that you need. But you'll see that suffix search order down there, and you'll see litware.com is listed in there. So you think, okay, I add litware.com in there. You go out to a command prompt, and you do ping server 1. And it doesn't resolve. And you're wondering why, since you set Litware in the suffix search order, why do you ping server 1? Why does it not resolve server1.litware.com? And the reason is that first bullet point, because Contoso.com was set at the GPO. The GPO changes a setting in the registry for this, and so does the GUI that you're looking at on the client in 2 different places. Not the same place in the registry. And the one that comes from the GPO overrides what you set in the GUI locally. And I have seen it time and time again where you will get a desktop guy going out trying to get an app to connect to your box, and he can't get it to work, and it looks legit. He has gone in and he has added it to the DNS suffix search order. There's no reason it shouldn't resolve, and group policy is why. What I can tell you is if you do an ipconfig/all from a command prompt, it will tell you the truth. So you can see the box down here at the bottom that if I had done an ipconfig, it would have showed Contoso.com and only Contoso.com. You would have never seen Litware here. So that's one of the dirtier group policy objects that I've ever seen, so you can see how tricky and crazy they can get. Let's talk real quick about security groups. With Active Directory, there's actually 3 different kinds of security groups that we get. We have global, domain local, and universal. Now, the one you're most familiar with is going to be the global group. And really, I just want you to be aware that there are 3 different types out here, okay? I'm not going to get into a major in-depth here on exactly what all they do. And you can download my slides later so that you can kind of get an idea. Global is the one you're most familiar with. Domain local is the one that's probably the least familiar, and then there's universal. All I want you to be aware of, or at least know to ask, is if you are using a universal group, those last 2 bullet points are imperative for you. Okay? You need to make sure that you have a global catalog in your site. That's what you need to ask your Active Directory person. If there's not, ask him if global catalog caching, that's what a GC is, a global catalog, is turned on in that site. Okay? That stuff needs to be there. If it's not, then you don't want to use a universal group. Won't get into the technical details. Shoot me an email if you're having problems with that. I'd be happy to explain that. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve into that today. But just be aware of that those are the questions that you need to ask. So let's take a look at nesting. With security groups, you can put a group inside of another group. Okay? That's called nesting. This gets interesting for a couple of reasons. let's say that your boss comes to you and says, you know what, John over here in the next queue, I'm going to have to let him go in like a couple of weeks. He has not been performing well. I suspect he's doing some stuff he shouldn't be doing. We need to keep an eye on this guy. Can you please make sure that he does not have access to your SQL Server number 4? And so you go in, you hit the SQL box, and you take a look at your logins, and you see that his username is not there anywhere. And let's say you go, oh, you know what? There's 4 different groups here, and these groups, I need to make sure that he's not a member of those. So you open up, you go to Active Directory, you take a look at every one of those groups, and sure enough, he is not in any of those groups. So you're good. You think, you know what? That's great. He doesn't have access. We're good to go. And then a week later, there's a bunch of data missing from a table, and John did it. And your boss is like, man, I told you to make sure that he didn't have access to this. What happened? What's going on? What you forgot to check was that he might have been in a group that was a member of one of those groups. Or maybe he was a member of a group that was a member of a group that was a member of a group. So you can nest these groups inside of each other, which can be a very handy thing. But when you're thinking about security and using these groups, you need to go all the way up to the top. Okay? You need to look recursively to the top. If you hit my blog, I blog on ryanjadams.com. I do have a blog post out there with a script that I wrote that will do this for you. It's very important that you have that and that you remember to look all the way up to the top. The other one is Kerberos. We're still getting to Kerberos here in a minute. But with Kerberos, there's a token access size. There's a limit here. You can only have 1,024 SID. That's a security identifier, which means that if we have a group accessing our SQL box, we can only have 1,024 in that group. If we have more than that, then Kerberos is going to fail because we've reached our size limit. That sounds like a lot. But if you start thinking about the nesting example we just talked about, now all of a sudden 1,024 doesn't seem as far out of scope as what we thought it was. We don't even have to have that many in there before we max out. There's a size limit here too. Now, size limit in Active Directory is 12K. You can go up to a max of 65K, and depending upon the group type, they're different. They hold a different value, a different size. So you could very easily hit that max before you actually hit 1,024. So these things that are popping up here at the bottom of the slide, this is the nesting rules of how they can be nested. Again, you can go to my blog, ryanjadams.com, click on presentations. You can download this presentation. I will give it to Julie. She can post it there on the DBA chapter site as well. So you can look this up after the fact. But these are the rules of what kind of groups you can put inside of another group. Remember we talked global, domain, local, and universal. This is kind of a diagram of how we can nest certain groups with inside others. When was the last time you went out and checked who had access to your database? And I don't mean that you went out and you took a look at logins and looked at how the logins were mapped to users in your databases. When was the last time you went and looked at the actual NTFS and LDF files themselves? You're thinking and probably having a hard time coming up with a date because it's pretty rare that somebody thinks to check that on a frequent basis. Okay, but we're sitting on top of an operating system and we need to be aware of that platform. And so I'm telling you that you need to get down security-wise to that all the way down to the NTFS file permissions. Don't stop at the folder. Go to the file. Okay? Don't use a deny ace. If you right-click any folder or file, you can do it right now as you're sitting there on your machines, and you go to Properties and you click on the Security tab, you'll notice that there's a list of accounts there, and that's called an ACL, Access Control List. Every single entry in there is an access control entry or an ACE. You can either grant or deny. Don't use a deny. You don't need to use a deny. If you don't want John to have access to that folder, you don't need to deny him. You just need to omit him. Leave him off completely, unless he's specifically granted, he won't be able to get in. So just omit it. Don't use a deny. The reason I say don't use a deny is because a deny overrides a grant. If for some reason John happened to be in let's say John happens to be in sales, and there's a particular file sales has been granted access to, and that's great. But there's a project that sales is working with marketing, and marketing's actually been denied. And so you think, you know what, I'm going to go over here and take Al out of the marketing group. He's working on this project. He needs to be granted access, so I'll just add him into the sales group temporarily. He's still going to get denied. Even though he was granted via the sales group, because he had to deny, either explicitly or because he was part of the marketing group, he will get denied. It overrides any other grant. So it's best to not get yourself in that scenario. Avoid it if you can. Permissions inherit from folder to folder and file to file. So when you see these things get inherited down, make sure you get all the way down to the file level. Don't stop at the folder. My little tip, this should pop up down here at the bottom here in a second on the slide. My tip says that you can have access to a file without having access to the folder that it's in. Which means that if John was granted access to the folder that your database files were in, and it was inherited from he was granted at the folder level, it inherits everything inside the files inside that folder, get inherited from the folder, and it comes down. Okay, well that's great, it's inherited down. And then I said, you know what, I want to make sure that changes up above me don't flow down. I'm going to remove inheritance from the folder level. I'm going to keep the existing permissions, but I'm going to go ahead and remove inheritance so that nobody can change anything after today. Great, fantastic. 2 months later, you go in and you need to deny John, and you put an explicit deny on that folder for John. But that file, you removed inheritance. It didn't inherit that permission. Now granted, if he were to go into Windows Explorer and he were to dig through all of the files, once he got to that folder, he would get denied. But if he were to open up Notepad and go File, Open, and type in the full path, c/my folder /my database.mdf, it's going to open. He's going to get access to that folder or that file. So remember, get down to the file level and check that inheritance. So in the interest of time, I'm going to speed up just a little bit. So bear with me as we kind of speed through some stuff here. Password policies. What I really want you to understand out of this is that the password policies don't come from SQL. They come from the local operating system, and the local operating system can be overridden from Active Directory. And what overrides them? A group policy object. Now if you're using Windows authentication, then you're using whatever setting has been set by the default domain policy on the domain controller. If you're thinking that, hey, I don't really trust their settings and I don't really want to use their settings, then what kind of scenario am I going to get into here? Can I just switch to SQL authentication and not worry about it? But that's not true, because SQL Server gets its settings from the local security policy via the LSA, the local security authority on the operating system, and that can be overridden by a group policy object. Can change those settings on the operating system. So even if you're using SQL auth accounts, you still don't get around it. The last two bullet points there say enforce password policy, meaning the complexity, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, that kind of stuff, and the password expiration. How long does that? So if you create a SQL auth account, does it ask you when you check off enforced password expiration, does it also ask you how long you want that to be? 30 days, 60, 90? It doesn't. Complexity, does it ask you uppercase, lowercase, special characters, and how many of those particular categories you want? It doesn't, because SQL Server is not making that call. I'm going to give you just a second to read what's in red at the top of this slide. I'm going to guess that the vast majority of you out there have seen this error before. If you haven't, and you use Windows authentication, you will eventually see this. What this means is if you set up a job in SQL Agent, there's an owner. By default, the owner is the person that created the job. And if you did it with your domain account, the first thing SQL Server tries to do is go figure out if it can resolve that account. It just wants to know if it exists. But who cares? Because the SQL agent, the context, the security context that it runs under, is the account that's running the SQL agent service account, not the owner, which means the owner doesn't matter at all. So my suggestion is change the owner to a SQL account and you'll never have this problem. In fact, it doesn't even have to be enabled. You could create a dummy account, maybe you use the SA account and you leave SA disabled. That's a perfect candidate. It doesn't even have to be an account that's turned on and legitimately enabled. It's really just looking to see that it's there. It doesn't run under that user account, okay? You can look this up later, but my tip there is that credentials and proxy accounts don't work if the SQL agent service is using what we call a user principal name. When you log in the morning, usually you type in, first name dot last name or whatever your logon name is, and there's a drop-down box for domain. There's two other ways to log on. One of them is a UPN. So what I could do is I could say ryan.adams@mydomain.com. I could type all that in the username field. It will automatically gray out the domain field when you do that. That's considered a UPN or a user principal name. Okay. Somebody in the question and answer said one thing to watch for on that last one is that if you make a change to the job, that the owner reverts back to you, and that's absolutely correct. So even if you go back and you make a change to this account or a change to your job, 3, 4, 5 months later, it will again, as soon as you save it and click OK, it's going to change it back to you again. You can write another job to make that change and those kinds of things. By the way, your SQL agent service account, your SQL Server service account should never be running using a UPN. That's kind of an edge case scenario. If you absolutely always use SQL Server Configuration Manager, do not go into services and set it there. If you use Configuration Manager, it will not allow you to use a UPN. SQL Server doesn't support UPNs. If you use Configuration Manager, you will never have this problem. If you decide you want to go in and do that, use a UPN in services, then you're going to have an issue. Let's talk about Kerberos. Julie, we're clearly going to go over time here. I'm going to stick with it as long as everybody else is willing to stick with me here a little bit. I know we're just kind of getting the fun part, but I'm going to move a little fast here, okay, guys? Here are some requirements for Kerberos. Your server and client have to be in the same domain or a trusted domain. Okay? If you're not, then you can't use Kerberos. You need to be using TCP/IP. They started allowing us to use Kerberos over name pipes in SQL 2008. You have to have a service principal name, and it has to be registered in Active Directory. Has to be, if you want to use Kerberos. Here's what's cool about this, or the biggest caveat. Service principal names have to be unique. If they're not unique, Kerberos will fail. But Active Directory itself doesn't care. It will allow you to duplicate a service principal name all day long. But Kerberos cares a lot, and it will fail. It has to be unique, even though Active Directory allows you to do it. Why do you want to use Kerberos over NTLM? These are your reasons. Mutual authentication, meaning that the server verifies that I am who I am. I want the server to verify that it is who it is, so I'm not looking at a man-in-the-middle attack. Okay? Kerberos requires it. NTLM does not. The server doesn't have to prove that it is who I thought it was if I use NTLM. Authentication is faster. Domain trust enhancement, that just means that it's transitive. We didn't really talk about that, nor will we. Delegated authority. I'm going to give you a prime example of exactly what delegated authority is here in a second. Let's look at how the flow of Kerberos works here, because this is the important piece of how it works. So what happens first is, and we'll see that we've got the KDC here on the top is a domain controller. We've got our client down below it, and we've got a server over to the right. That's the SQL server that we're trying to get to. The first thing we do is we talk to the domain controller, give it our username and password. We open up what we call a TGS request. All it is a communication channel between me and the domain controller. And I tell it, hey, I'm trying to get to the server. Can you give me a ticket to get to the server? Okay. So I put a service ticket request in. It gives me the ticket. It passes the ticket down to the client. When I receive that ticket, I will take it and hand it off to the server. That's considered a single hop. Very simple and easy. Here's where things get a little more complicated. This is what happens when we get into delegation. Remember, you have to use Kerberos in order to get delegation. NTLM will not do this for you. You'll have to use Kerb in order to do this. The example I'm going to use here is a distributed reporting services solution. Okay. Up top we have our domain controller, we have our client. Now I am trying to access a report on the reporting services box that's sitting in the middle. But the data that's required to render those reports is sitting on the SQL server on the far right hand side. Okay. Again, I'm going to open up my TGS request first, and I'm going to request a ticket. I'm going to ask for a ticket to access the reporting services server box. I'm going to get the ticket from the domain controller. I'm going to pass that ticket off to the reporting services box. Now at this point what happens is reporting services looks at my ticket and goes, hey, you're trying to get to report number 4. Yep, looks good. You have access to report 4. That's fantastic. However, I see that report 4 also has some data sources, and that data sits on the SQL server that's outside, that's not me, that's somewhere else. I'm going to need to go make sure that you've got access to be able to see that data. This is called delegation. So it allows reporting services to take your ticket on your behalf, and he is going to present it to the SQL server. He's not going to use his ticket. He's taking yours on your behalf, presenting it to the SQL server to see if you have access to the data. If you have access to the data, great, we return. This is called a double hop. Okay. We can add more servers in between this chain of 3. It can get deeper than that. But this is a great reason why we want to use Kerberos. It's far more secure, and we get to use delegation, and we're in a distributed environment. It's our only choice. NTLM cannot do this. Now, I told you a requirement for Kerberos in order to get that scenario to work is you having a service principal name. Now, you can register them manually or you can do it dynamically. If you do it manually, the drawback is you got to figure out what it is. You also need permissions in Active Directory to actually be able to add the SPN on the account, and a lot of DBAs don't have that right. Now, we can give SQL Server permissions to do it so that we don't even have to worry about it. Okay. If we do that, we can go into Self on that account, and we can give it one of these 3. Again, you can download my slide deck. You don't have to write them down. These 3 are all the same. You only need one of them. It depends on what version of Active Directory you're using. They change the name between different versions. Now, with dynamic, the interesting thing about that is it's great because SQL Server handles it. It registers the name when SQL Server starts, but when SQL Server stops, it also removes it. So now those examples of replication that we talked about at the very beginning come into play big time, right? Because if that change hasn't replicated yet, then we don't get what we expect. If you call Microsoft, they will tell you Premier Field Support will tell you that if you're using a cluster, do not use dynamic, to use static. That is a great suggestion. I can tell you that if your site topology is turned on correctly, or configured correctly, and you have urgent replication turned on, that you can kind of mitigate that. I have not ever had a problem with it personally, with clusters. But I have a very well-designed site topology, and I have urgent replication turned on. Not something you need to know about. I actually have a blog post on how to do it because it's not easy. Even for an Active Directory guy, urgent replication is not easy to turn on. It's not a checkbox kind of a thing. But I do have something out there to kind of help some folks with that. You just need to know what to ask him, right? Is urgent replication turned on? If he tells you no, then you need to do this manually, okay? Now, of course, the negative to a manual is if the server name changes, you have to go change the SPN. But then again, server name changes don't necessarily happen that often. You need to know what it looks like. Well, here's examples of exactly what it looks like. This top section is what SQL Server will do. Okay, it's going to do, for TCP connections, it's going to do MS SQL SVC / fully qualified domain name, right? server1.microsoft.com, not just server1, but the fully qualified domain name, and then colon whatever port it happens to be running on. So if it's, a default instance, we're on 1433. If it's a named instance, then whatever port that happens to be on. If it's a named instance and you're letting it do it dynamically, you need to set a static port. Otherwise, when the port changes, you would have to go in and change your SPN and start all over again. And then here's what it does for name pipes. What I will tell you is that's great if you're going to do it manually. Do that. But also add service principal names for the NetBIOS name as well. That way it works whether you're using FQDN or NetBIOS name. Where do they go? This is the common question. Great, I know what the service principal name is. Where do I put it? What account does it go on? Well, SQL Server is running under a domain account. That's where it goes, on that user account, that service account that you're using. If, however, you're running your SQL Server under local system, local service, or network service, then it actually goes on the computer object account. All right. So I realize that we went over. I appreciate you guys bearing with me. This is a good summary. This is all different things that we talked about. Okay, we covered a lot of stuff here today. We didn't get super in depth on some of this stuff, but we covered a lot. But I hope that you guys are able to at least learn and get a good idea of the questions that you need to ask when you have problems, and ask your Active Directory guys when even they can't figure it out to help point them in the right direction. It will save you time in the long run. Again, you guys can follow me on Twitter. I'm Ryan J. Adams. You can see down there for Twitter. I do blog. I've got a blog on there, ryanjadams.com, and my email address. So I appreciate everyone for attending today and kind of bearing with me as we went a little bit over. I know it's a lot of material.
Thank you, Ryan, for a very I thought it was kind of in-depth. I thought it was very useful on the Active Directory and how it all relates with the SQL Server. We'll try to get the questions over to you, so if you wanted to, you can answer those. But yeah,
that would be great. Yeah, send the questions over to me, and I can answer them on my blog. And I'm willing to. I mean, if you've got a few people willing to hang around, I'll answer them now.
Yeah, that's up to you. Can you see the questions?
I can. Yeah. Let me kind of scroll back.
The first one's a little in depth. This is being recorded and will be posted on the DBA Virtual Chapter archive menu.
All right, so let me read through here.
Get lower half of the slides.
So I had one question about what about the other settings in policy 2 that did not conflict. So that kind of, and that was from Mark. So Mark, how that works, that depends on the scenario. If I were to go back to that slide, so if you remember that slide and how that worked and the flow that comes down, it depends on whether we have a block in play or not. But for the ones that do not conflict, they will apply unless there's a block. If there's a block, then they don't. But any of those settings that did not conflict, those guys will apply unless there's a block and play. All right, let's see. Okay, about the script for nested security groups. If you go to ryanjadams.com, that's my blog, you should be able to find that post out there. Somebody asked, where do you find the inheritance settings? So that's a good question. If you were to go to a folder or file, you right-clicked and went to Properties and went over to the Security tab. You actually have to click on Advanced button in order to see the inheritance settings. And it's in a column over on the right-hand side. It'll tell you where it's inherited from. When you click on Change Permissions, it'll actually allow you at that point to either remove the inheritance or to be able to see what it is. There's also a tab called Effective Permissions, which will allow you to see what permissions are actually effective on that file or folder for a particular user. Because that John may have gotten permissions 50 folders up, and you want to know if he has permission. So what you can do is you can go to the folder you're curious about or the file you're curious about, property security. You can go over there to the Effective Settings tab, type in his user account, and it'll tell you what his particular security settings are. Okay, any advice on what's best to choose between multiple host A records versus multiple C name for DNS alias? You know, I think for me, I would generally use a C name record as opposed to multiple host records. Simply because when you create multiple host records, it's usually going to create, and not always, it depends on the DNS configuration, but most of the time it's set up to automatically create that reverse PTR record. But if you do a CNAME record, it doesn't create a PTR for that. So you kind of avoid that multiple reverse lookup situation that we talked about if you're using an alias. So for me, I think I would use an alias over having multiple host records. For me, the only reason I would ever use a host record is just to obfuscate a name. So like we talked about, if you've got a naming convention of servers and it's got a really nasty looking name that you don't want your users to type in, then I might use an alias for that situation. But generally speaking, I want every resource to have its own IP address. I would never like intentionally want to give you know, multiple names on a particular IP. I'd rather just, you know, go get another IP for the other name. How can you use a GPO to assign a unique account to the SQL service? So in order for me to answer that question, that's not one I can verbally answer. That's one that would be better to actually show you, which I don't have time for here. But there is a setting that you can do that for. And what you're doing, and this applies to any service on the operating system, period, not just SQL Server, okay? Any service, you can actually go in and tell it what account to use, and it will enforce that. And by the way, group policy objects, they get refreshed in the background by default every 60 minutes. So that reverse change might not happen instantly, but it will take effect. Let's see, how does SQL Server determine permissions for an Active Directory user who is in different groups set up with permissions? Is there an order it goes in? Does it merge permissions for all groups you are in when checking permissions? So if I understand that correctly, what you're getting at is how does it work if I have a person that's in multiple groups or different groups? How do those permissions get determined? So maybe I've got a resource and this guy happens to be part of sales and marketing. How, you know, is it merging those permissions down to the file or folder, or how is it doing that? So usually what happens is when you go to the domain controller and you get your Kerberos ticket, it's going to actually list every single group that you are a member of. And it will do it recursively for every group that you're a member of. And it will have that all inside of your ticket. So that way when you go present your ticket to that resource in that server, it can look at the ticket and say, yep, either it's in the list or it's not. What's the difference if a SQL Server service is running as local service or as a domain account? Really the difference there is exactly how much permissions does it have on the local box. So if I'm running it as local service, it can pretty much do anything that it wants on the box. Okay, it's almost like being a local admin, which means it can actually have the effect of changing things as a local administrator. Whereas if I give it an Active Directory account, I don't have to provide it those permissions. So one of the changes they made between SQL 2008 and 2012 is in 2008 they automatically added the local administrators group into the DBO schema. So he was automatically an admin. Well, they removed that in 2012. That's why there's a new screen that asks you, hey, what account do you want to add as an admin? And that's one of the reasons why. Ooh, here's a good one. Do you need to restart servers to apply a GPO? No, you don't, with a few exceptions. You can actually do, and I didn't get into, I've got another version of this presentation that's almost 2 hours long, but there are tools that you can use for GPOs, and one's called GP Update, and you can do a /force, and that will automatically force a GPO to refresh. However, there are a few settings, and I can tell you that the startup, shutdown, login, and logout scripts are the exceptions to the rule, that those do require reboots. I have seen them require 2 reboots, but those are just a few exceptions to the rule. Most of the time, a GP Update force will go ahead and take care of those.
Well, Ryan, we're about 15 minutes over. I'll try to save the question log and get that over to you. Again, I wanted to really thank you for your presentation this afternoon and sticking around for the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you guys having me. I appreciate everybody coming and joining us today.
Stop the recording. Stop the recording.
Save the questions log, Julie.
Okay, file, save questions log.
Yep.
Saving as a rich text file, is that correct?
Yep, that's the only choice you get.
Okay, I save that, and then and I stop the recording.
Yep. Now you can end the webinar.
Change presentation. Change presenter, now viewing, screen save. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
File.
File, exit, and webinar.
End webinar.
Okay. And then it will give me the information about, it'll show that it's converting.
Yep.
Okay. Bye.
Great, Julie. Thank you. Bye, Ryan.
Bye, folks.
The organizer has ended